The scream tore through the mountain silence like a knife through silk, and Ryder McAllister's head snapped up from the deer tracks he'd been studying in the soft earth of the high country trail. He stood motionless for a heartbeat, his powerful frame tensed like a coiled spring, listening with the keen attention of a man who had spent the last 8 years living alone in these Sierra Nevada mountains. The sound had come from the east, maybe half a mile away, carried on the wind that swept down from the snow-capped peaks above. Without hesitation, Ryder broke into a run, his long legs eating up the ground with practiced ease, his shoulder-length dark hair streaming behind him as he navigated the rocky terrain with the sure-footedness of a mountain lion. It was late September of 1878, and the aspens were just beginning to turn gold at this elevation, their leaves shimmering in the afternoon sunlight that filtered through the dense pine forest. Ryder had been tracking a buck for the better part of the morning, planning to lay in meat for the coming winter, but now all thoughts of hunting fled from his mind. That scream had been pure terror, and out here in the wilderness, terror usually meant death was close at hand. He crashed through a thicket of scrub oak, his buckskin shirt catching on the branches, and emerged onto a narrow trail that wound along the mountainside. There, about 200 yards ahead, he saw it. A massive pine tree had fallen across the path, and beneath its enormous trunk he could see the flutter of a blue dress and hear the desperate, gasping sobs of a woman. Ryder covered the distance in seconds, his heart pounding not from exertion, but from the spike of adrenaline that shot through his veins. As he approached, he could see her more clearly. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, with honey-colored hair that had come loose from its pins and spread across the dusty ground like a halo. Her face was pale with pain and shock, and her blue eyes were wide with fear as they fixed on him. "Please," she gasped, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please help me. I cannot feel my legs." Ryder dropped to his knees beside her, his dark eyes quickly assessing the situation. The tree was a monster, easily 3 feet in diameter at the trunk, and it had pinned her across her lower back and legs. From the way she was positioned, he could tell she had been walking along the trail when the tree had given way. The roots were still attached to the earth, pulled partially free but not completely, and fresh soil clung to the exposed network of wood. A gust of wind must have been the final straw for a tree already weakened by disease or age. "I'm going to get you out," Ryder said, his voice calm and steady despite the urgency of the situation. "What is your name?" "Laura," she whispered, tears streaming down her dirt-smudged cheeks. "Laura Emerson. I was riding to Quartz Hill, California, but my horse spooked at a rattlesnake and threw me. I was trying to walk back to find him when I heard a terrible cracking sound, and then everything went dark." "All right, Laura Emerson," Ryder said, moving to examine the tree more closely. "My name is Ryder McAllister, and I need you to stay very still while I figure out how to move this." The problem was immediately apparent. The tree was far too heavy to simply roll off her, and there was nothing nearby that he could use as a lever to lift it. The only option was brute strength, and even for a man of Ryder's considerable size and power, it would be a near impossible task. He stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, with broad shoulders and arms thick with muscle from years of swinging an axe, hauling game, and wrestling with the harsh demands of mountain life. But this tree had to weigh close to 2,000 pounds, and the section pinning Laura was solid trunk, not branches. "I'm going to lift it," Ryder said simply, positioning himself at the thickest part of the trunk that lay across her body. "When I do, you need to pull yourself free as fast as you can. Do you understand?" Laura's eyes widened even further. "You cannot possibly lift that," she said, her voice trembling. "It is too heavy. You need to go for help." "There is no time," Ryder replied, his jaw set in a hard line. "If your spine is damaged, every minute counts, and I am not leaving you alone out here with night coming on. The wolves and mountain lions come out after dark." He did not mention the other danger, the one that made his gut clench with urgency. If she could not feel her legs, there was a real possibility that her back was broken, and internal bleeding could be killing her right now. He had seen it before, years ago during his time as a lawman, before he had fled civilization and all its painful memories to live alone in these mountains. Ryder positioned his feet wide, bending his knees and sliding his hands beneath the rough bark of the tree trunk. He could feel the sharp edges biting into his palms, but he ignored the pain. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs completely, and then he began to lift. The tree did not budge. Ryder exhaled explosively and tried again, this time letting out a roar of effort that echoed off the surrounding mountainsides. The muscles in his back and legs screamed in protest, his shoulders burning with the strain, and for a moment he thought it was hopeless. But then, incredibly, he felt the tree shift. It was only an inch, maybe two, but it moved. "Now!" he bellowed, his face red with exertion, the veins in his neck standing out like cords. "Pull yourself out now!" Laura, galvanized by the desperation in his voice, began to claw at the ground, pulling herself forward with her hands. She could feel nothing below her waist, and the terror of that realization gave her strength she did not know she possessed. Her fingers dug into the dirt, her nails breaking as she dragged herself inch by agonizing inch out from under the crushing weight. Ryder's vision began to tunnel, black spots dancing at the edges as his body demanded oxygen he could not spare. His arms trembled violently, and he knew he had only seconds left before his strength gave out completely. The tree seemed to be pressing down on him now, as if it were a living thing determined to crush the woman beneath it. "Almost!" Laura gasped, her voice high and tight with pain and fear. "Almost there!" With a final desperate heave, Ryder lifted the tree another precious few inches, and Laura pulled her legs free. The moment he saw she was clear, he released his grip and staggered backward, the tree crashing back to the ground with a thunderous boom that sent up a cloud of dust and pine needles. Ryder fell to his hands and knees, gasping for air, his entire body shaking with exhaustion. For a long moment, he could do nothing but breathe, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. When he finally looked up, he saw Laura lying on her back a few feet away, her hands pressed to her face as she sobbed with relief. He crawled over to her on trembling limbs and gently pulled her hands away from her face. "Let me see you," he said softly. "Are you hurt anywhere else? Any bleeding?" Laura shook her head, unable to speak through her tears. Ryder ran his hands carefully along her arms and ribs, checking for broken bones, and then moved to her legs. He pressed gently along the length of each limb, watching her face for signs of pain. "Can you feel that?" he asked as his fingers probed her left knee. "Yes," Laura whispered, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. But this time they were tears of relief. "Yes, I can feel it. Oh God, I can feel my legs again." Ryder sat back on his heels, his own relief so profound it made him dizzy. "The pressure probably just pinched the nerves," he said, his voice rough. "You may have some bruising, maybe some damage to the muscles, but I do not think anything is broken." He stood up slowly, every muscle in his body protesting, and extended his hand to her. "We need to get you off this mountain before dark. Can you stand?" Laura took his hand, marveling at the size and strength of it, even as she used it to pull herself upright. Her legs wobbled dangerously, and sharp pains shot through her back and hips, but she managed to stay on her feet. "I think so," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Ryder did not hesitate. He bent and swept her up into his arms as easily as if she weighed no more than a child, cradling her against his broad chest. Laura gasped in surprise, her arms instinctively going around his neck. "I can walk," she protested weakly, though in truth she was not at all certain that was true. "Maybe," Ryder agreed, "but we will make better time this way, and we need to get off this trail before full dark. My cabin is about 3 miles north of here. You can rest there tonight, and in the morning I will take you down to Quartz Hill." Laura wanted to argue, wanted to maintain some shred of dignity and independence, but the truth was she felt as weak as a newborn foal, and the thought of trying to navigate these treacherous mountain trails in her condition filled her with dread. So instead, she simply nodded and let her head rest against his shoulder, breathing in the scent of him, pine and wood smoke and clean sweat. As Ryder began to walk, his long strides carrying them steadily northward along a trail only he seemed able to see, Laura found herself studying his profile. He had a strong face, all hard angles and sharp planes, with a jaw covered in several days' worth of dark stubble. His nose had been broken at least once, and there was a thin white scar that ran from his left eyebrow up into his hairline. But his eyes, when they had looked at her, had been surprisingly gentle, a deep brown that reminded her of rich earth after rain. "You saved my life," Laura said softly, the reality of it finally sinking in. "That tree would have killed me if you had not come along." Ryder's expression did not change. "I was in the right place at the right time," he said simply. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Laura said with certainty. "Not anyone could have lifted that tree. I've never seen anything like that. You must be the strongest man in California." A ghost of a smile touched Ryder's lips. "I doubt that. But I have had a lot of practice chopping wood and hauling game. You build muscle living up here." They walked in silence for a while, the only sounds the crunch of Ryder's boots on the rocky trail and the whisper of wind through the pines. The sun was sinking lower now, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and the temperature was beginning to drop. Laura shivered, and Ryder immediately adjusted his grip so that he could hold her closer, sharing his body heat. "How long have you lived in these mountains?" Laura asked, partly out of genuine curiosity and partly to distract herself from the throbbing pain in her back and legs. 8 years, Ryder replied, his eyes scanning the darkening forest with the constant vigilance of a man who knew its dangers intimately. "I came up here in the spring of 1870. "That's a long time to be alone," Laura said softly. Ryder's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I prefer it that way." There was something in his tone that warned Laura not to press the subject, so she let it drop. Instead, she asked, "What were you doing out on that trail? When you heard me scream, I mean." "Hunting," Ryder said. "I was tracking a buck. Winter comes early and hard at this elevation, and I need to lay in meat while I can." "I am sorry I ruined your hunt," Laura said. Ryder looked down at her then, and for the first time his expression softened. "Do not apologize," he said firmly. "A deer is just meat. A human life is precious. There will be other bucks." Laura felt her cheeks warm at the intensity of his gaze, and she looked away, suddenly very aware of how close they were, of the way his arms held her so securely, of the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her ear. It was strange and inappropriate, she told herself, to be having such thoughts about a man she had just met, and under such circumstances. But there was something about Ryder McAllister that called to something deep inside her, something she had not known existed until this moment. The cabin appeared suddenly, materializing out of the gathering dusk like something from a dream. It was small but solidly built, constructed of thick logs chinked with mud and moss, with a stone chimney at one end and a covered porch at the front. Deer antlers were mounted above the door, and stacks of split firewood lined the sides of the structure, enough to last through multiple winters. Ryder carried Laura up the steps and pushed open the door with his shoulder, then gently set her down on a bench near the fireplace. The interior was sparse but clean, with a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs, a narrow bed covered with furs and quilts, shelves lined with supplies and equipment, and various pelts hanging from the rafters to cure. A rifle and a shotgun hung above the door, and there were several wicked-looking knives in a rack on the wall. "Wait here," Ryder said unnecessarily, as Laura was not at all certain she could stand even if she wanted to. He moved to the fireplace and began building a fire with practiced efficiency, and within minutes, flames were crackling cheerfully, pushing back the cold and dark. Once the fire was going, Ryder filled a kettle from a water barrel in the corner and hung it on a hook over the flames to heat. Then he turned his attention back to Laura, kneeling in front of her with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his size and rough appearance. "I need to check your injuries properly," he said. "With your permission, I would like to examine your back and legs to make sure there's no serious damage." Laura's face flamed red, but she nodded. She understood the necessity, even if the thought of this stranger seeing her in a state of undress was mortifying. "What do you need me to do?" "Just sit still," Ryder said. He moved behind her and began carefully unlacing the back of her dress, his large fingers surprisingly deft with the tiny buttons and ties. Once he had loosened the garment enough, he gently pulled the fabric away from her back, along with the thin chemise beneath, exposing the pale skin to the firelight. Laura heard him draw in a sharp breath, and her heart clenched with fear. "How bad is it?" "You're going to have some impressive bruising," Ryder said grimly, his fingers ghosting over her skin with incredible lightness, checking for broken bones or internal injuries. "There is already discoloration across your lower back and down your left hip. Does this hurt?" He pressed gently on a spot just above her left kidney. Laura winced. "Yes, but not terribly. It is more of an ache than a sharp pain." Ryder continued his examination in silence, his touch clinical and impersonal despite the intimacy of the situation. When he was satisfied that there were no broken bones or signs of internal bleeding, he carefully pulled her clothing back into place and moved around to face her again. "You were lucky," he said. "Very lucky. You're going to be in pain for a few days, maybe a week or more, but I do not think there is any permanent damage. You will need to rest and avoid any strenuous activity until the bruising fades." "Thank you," Laura said, her voice barely above a whisper, "for everything. I do not know how I can ever repay you." "You do not owe me anything," Ryder said firmly. He stood and moved to the shelves, pulling down various jars and containers. "I'm going to make you some willow bark tea for the pain, and then you need to eat something. You have had a bad shock, and your body needs fuel to heal." As Ryder busied himself preparing the tea and a simple meal of beans, salt pork, and cornbread left over from his breakfast, Laura found herself watching him with growing fascination. There was something deeply appealing about the way he moved through the space, completely comfortable and competent, his large frame somehow not seeming out of place in the small cabin. He was a man utterly at home in his environment, and there was a kind of quiet strength to him that went beyond the merely physical. When the tea was ready, Ryder brought her a tin cup filled with the steaming liquid. Laura sipped it carefully, grimacing at the bitter taste, but grateful for the warmth. Almost immediately, she could feel the medicine beginning to work, the sharp edges of her pain softening and dulling. The meal was simple, but surprisingly good, and Laura realized with a start that she was ravenous. She had not eaten since a hasty breakfast at the boarding house in Mariposa that morning before setting out on her journey. That seemed like a lifetime ago now. "Tell me about yourself, Laura Emerson," Ryder said as they ate, his dark eyes studying her across the table. "What brings you to these mountains? Quartz Hill is not exactly a destination for most young ladies traveling alone." Laura set down her fork and folded her hands in her lap. "I am going to be the new school teacher," she said. "The town council hired me through correspondence after their previous teacher moved back east to care for her ailing mother. I'm from Sacramento originally, but I have been teaching in Mariposa for the past 2 years." "A school teacher," Ryder said, something unreadable flickering across his face. "That is admirable work." "It is important work," Laura said with quiet conviction, "especially in these small towns. Education is the foundation of civilization, Mr. McAllister. Without it, we are no better than savages." Ryder's expression hardened slightly at her words, though his voice remained even. "Some might argue that civilization is not all it is cracked up to be. There are plenty of so-called civilized men who are far more savage than any wolf or bear." Laura sensed she had touched on something painful, some old wound that had never properly healed. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I did not mean to offend you." Ryder shook his head, his expression clearing. "You did not offend me. And you are right, of course. Children need education. I hope the people of Quartz Hill appreciate what they are getting in you." "What about you?" Laura asked. "Did you go to school?" "I did," Ryder said, "through the 8th grade, which was considered quite good for a boy growing up on a farm in Missouri. My mother was a great believer in the value of learning. She taught me to read before I could even write, and we had 3 whole books in our house, which was considered a fortune: the Bible, Robinson Crusoe, and a collection of Shakespeare's plays." "Your mother sounds like a wonderful woman," Laura said. "She was," Ryder agreed, his voice softening with memory. "She died when I was 14. Fever took her. After that, my father never quite recovered. He sort of faded away over the next few years until he just did not wake up one morning. I was 17 by then, and there was nothing left for me on that farm, so I headed west." "And you became a mountain man," Laura said. "Eventually," Ryder replied. "First, I tried my hand at mining, then ranching. Then I was a lawman for a while. But none of it suited me like these mountains do. Up here, a man can be free. No one asking questions, no expectations, no disappointments. Just you and the land and the changing seasons." Laura wanted to ask what had happened, what had driven him to seek such complete isolation, but she could see from the shuttered look in his eyes that he would not welcome such questions. So instead, she said, "It must be beautiful up here in winter." "It is," Ryder agreed. "Harsh and deadly, but beautiful. The snow gets deep, sometimes over 10 feet in the passes, and the cold can freeze a man solid in minutes if he is caught out unprepared. But there is a purity to it, a kind of terrible honesty. The mountain does not pretend to be anything other than what it is. They finished their meal in companionable silence, and then Ryder insisted that Laura take his bed while he made a pallet near the fire. Laura protested, but he would not hear of it, and eventually she was too exhausted to argue. She limped to the bed, wincing with every step, and sank gratefully onto the surprisingly soft mattress of corn husks and pine boughs. As she lay there in the darkness, listening to the crackle of the fire and the soft sounds of Ryder settling himself for the night, Laura found herself thinking about the strange turn her life had taken. Just this morning, she had been excited about her new position, eager to make a fresh start in a new town. Now she was lying in a mountain man's cabin, her body battered and bruised, her carefully made plans thrown into chaos. And yet, as she drifted off to sleep, she found that she was not unhappy. In fact, there was a strange sense of rightness to being here, in this place, with this man who had literally moved a mountain to save her life. It made no logical sense, but Laura had learned long ago that the heart rarely dealt in logic. She woke the next morning to the smell of coffee and frying bacon. Pale sunlight was streaming through the cabin's single window, and she could hear Ryder moving around, preparing breakfast. Laura tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest, and the bruises on her back and legs had stiffened overnight until she felt as rigid as a piece of lumber. "Easy," Ryder's deep voice said from nearby. Laura looked over to see him approaching with another cup of willow bark tea. "You're going to be sore for a few days. Drink this, and then we will see about getting some food into you." Laura accepted the tea gratefully and drank it down, despite the unpleasant taste. Ryder watched her with an expression of concern that seemed strange on his hard features, and when she finished, he helped her to her feet with a gentleness that belied his massive strength. Walking was an exercise in agony, but Laura gritted her teeth and made it to the table, determined not to show weakness. Ryder served up plates of bacon, eggs, and thick slices of bread toasted over the fire, and they ate together as the morning sun climbed higher in the sky. "I have been thinking," Ryder said as he mopped up the last of his eggs with a piece of bread. "You are in no condition to make the journey down to Quartz Hill on foot, and your horse is probably halfway to Oregon by now. I can carry you again, but that would take the better part of 2 days given the terrain." "What are you suggesting?" Laura asked. "I have a horse," Ryder said. "Big fellow, draft horse mixed with Mustang. Strong enough to carry both of us. If we ride, we can make it to Quartz Hill by nightfall. But you would have to ride in front of me in the saddle, and I would need to hold you to keep you steady. Given your injuries and the fact that we barely know each other, I understand if you would prefer to wait a few days until you are stronger and can ride alone." Laura considered this carefully. The thought of being held so intimately by a man she had just met was indeed scandalous, and if anyone saw them arriving in town together like that, her reputation could be permanently damaged before she even began her new position. But the alternative was to stay here in this cabin for days, alone with Ryder, which would be even worse for her reputation if it were discovered. "I think we should go today," Laura said finally. "The school is expecting me, and I have already missed my scheduled arrival. The longer I delay, the more questions will be asked." Ryder nodded, seeming neither pleased nor displeased by her decision. "Then we will leave within the hour. I need to pack some supplies and saddle Thunder, and you should prepare yourself for a long ride. It will not be comfortable with your injuries." Thunder turned out to be an enormous beast, easily 17 hands tall, with a coat the color of storm clouds and legs like tree trunks. He watched with intelligent eyes as Ryder saddled him and secured a pack behind the saddle, and he did not so much as twitch when Ryder lifted Laura up as if she weighed nothing and settled her side saddle on the horse's broad back. Ryder swung up behind her a moment later, his arms coming around her to grasp the reins, effectively enclosing her in a cage of muscle and warmth. Laura felt her breath catch at the sudden intimacy of it, the way she fit against him as if they had been designed for exactly this purpose. "Comfortable?" Ryder's voice rumbled from just behind her ear, sending an unexpected shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the morning chill. "Yes," Laura managed to say, though in truth she was anything but comfortable. The pain from her injuries was considerable, but it was the awareness of Ryder's body pressed against hers that truly unsettled her. They set off at a walk, Thunder picking his way carefully down the rocky trail that wound through the dense forest. The morning was beautiful, the air crisp and clean, smelling of pine and earth and the distant hint of snow from the high peaks. Birds sang in the trees, and once they saw a doe and her fawn drinking from a clear stream that tumbled over smooth stones. As they rode, Ryder pointed out various landmarks and told Laura about the mountain, sharing knowledge accumulated over 8 years of solitary living. He showed her which plants were edible and which were poison, which animal tracks to avoid and which were harmless, where the best fishing holes were, and where the bears liked to den in winter. Laura listened with genuine interest, asking questions and storing away the information, even though she doubted she would ever have need of it. But more than the words themselves, she found herself captivated by the sound of his voice, the way it resonated through his chest and into her back, creating a strange kind of intimacy that went beyond the merely physical. By midday, they had descended out of the high country and were passing through a region of rolling hills covered in oak and manzanita. The temperature had risen considerably, and Laura could feel sweat trickling down her back where she pressed against Ryder. If he was uncomfortable, he gave no sign of it, his attention focused on the trail ahead and the surrounding landscape. They stopped briefly to rest Thunder and eat a cold lunch of jerky and hardtack from Ryder's pack, sitting in the shade of a massive oak tree while the horse grazed on the dry grass. Laura's back and legs were throbbing with a deep bone-level ache that the morning dose of willow bark tea had long since stopped masking, but she tried not to let it show. Ryder saw through her brave face immediately. "You are in pain," he said flatly. It was not a question. "I will survive," Laura replied, trying to keep her voice light. "I have endured worse." Ryder's eyes sharpened with interest. "What could be worse than having a tree fall on you?" Laura hesitated, then decided there was no point in hiding the truth. "My father," she said quietly. "He was not a kind man, especially after my mother died. He had a temper and a fondness for whiskey, and sometimes those two things combined in unfortunate ways." Ryder's expression darkened with an anger that was all the more frightening for how carefully he controlled it. "He hit you." "He did," Laura admitted, "for years, until I was 18 and finally old enough to leave. I went to Sacramento and enrolled in the normal school to become a teacher. I've been supporting myself ever since." "Where is he now?" Ryder asked, his voice dangerously soft. "Dead," Laura said. "He got into a fight in a saloon 3 years ago and someone stabbed him. I did not go to the funeral." Ryder nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. A man who would raise his hand to a woman, especially his own daughter, is no man at all. He deserved what he got. They sat in silence for a moment, and then Ryder reached into his pack and pulled out a small leather pouch. From it, he shook out several dried leaves into his palm and offered them to Laura. "Chew these," he instructed. "They are from the poplar tree. They will help with the pain more than the willow bark." Laura accepted the leaves and put them in her mouth, grimacing at the bitter taste, but chewing obediently. Within a few minutes, she felt a pleasant numbness spreading through her body, dulling the worst of the pain without making her feel foggy or confused. "Better?" Ryder asked. "Much," Laura admitted. "Thank you." They remounted and continued their journey. And as the afternoon wore on, Laura found herself relaxing more and more against Ryder's solid warmth. The medicine had helped with the pain, but it was more than that. There was something deeply comforting about being held by him, about the steady rhythm of Thunder's gait, and the sure confidence with which Ryder guided them down the mountain. She found herself thinking about what he had told her the night before, about his life as a lawman and his decision to abandon civilization for the solitude of the high country. What had happened to make him flee so completely? What kind of pain or betrayal could drive a man to such isolation? "May I ask you a personal question?" Laura said softly. She felt Ryder tense slightly behind her. "You may ask," he said carefully. "I cannot promise I will answer." "Why did you leave civilization?" Laura asked. "Last night you said you were a lawman before you came to the mountains. What happened?" For a long moment, Ryder said nothing, and Laura thought he was going to refuse to answer. But then he sighed, a deep, weary sound that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul. "I was a deputy marshal in San Francisco," he said quietly. It was 1869, and the city was booming with gold money and railroad money, And with all that prosperity came crime, theft, murder, corruption at every level. I thought I was making a difference, thought I was protecting people and upholding the law. He paused, and Laura waited patiently for him to continue. I had a partner, Ryder went on, his voice flat and distant. His name was Thomas. We'd been friends since childhood, grew up together back in Missouri. When I headed west, he came with me, and we both ended up wearing badges. We were good at the work, and we trusted each other completely. Or at least I thought we did. Laura felt her heart sink as she began to understand where this story was going. There was a woman, Ryder continued. Her name was Catherine. She was beautiful and educated and from a good family, and for some reason I will never understand, she chose me. We were engaged to be married, had set a date and everything. I thought I was the luckiest man alive. But Thomas wanted her too, Laura said softly. I did not know it at the time, Ryder said. He hid it well, congratulated me, stood up as my best man at the wedding that never happened. Because 2 days before we were supposed to be married, I came home early from a patrol and found them together in my own bed. Catherine and Thomas, the two people I trusted most in the world, and they had been carrying on behind my back for months. Laura felt tears prick her eyes at the raw pain in his voice, even though 8 years had passed since the betrayal. I am so sorry, she whispered. I broke Thomas's jaw and 3 of his ribs, Ryder said, his voice still eerily calm. I would have killed him if the other deputies had not pulled me off. I resigned my badge that night, packed what little I owned, and headed into the mountains. I have not been back to civilization since, except to trade furs once or twice a year in the small towns on the edges of the wilderness. What happened to them? Laura asked. To Thomas and Catherine? I do not know, Ryder said, and I do not care. They are dead to me, just like that whole life is dead. Up here in the mountains, a man does not have to worry about being betrayed. The dangers are honest ones. A grizzly bear does not pretend to be your friend before it tries to kill you. Laura turned her head slightly so she could see his profile. His jaw was set in a hard line, his dark eyes fixed on the distant horizon. Not all people are like that, she said gently. There are good people in the world, honest people who would never betray the trust you place in them. Maybe, Ryder said, though his tone suggested he did not really believe it. But I have no interest in finding out. I am content with my life as it is. Laura wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that isolating himself from all human connection was no way to live, that he was letting the actions of 2 terrible people poison his entire future. But she held her tongue. She had known him for less than 24 hours, and she had no right to lecture him about his choices, no matter how much his pain touched her heart. They rode in silence for another hour, and then the trail rounded a bend, and suddenly Quartz Hill spread out below them. It was a small town, probably no more than 200 souls, built along a creek that glittered in the late afternoon sun. Laura could see a main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a church with a white steeple, and scattered houses spreading out in all directions. Smoke rose from dozens of chimneys, and even from this distance she could hear the faint sounds of activity, hammering, the lowing of cattle, children's laughter. There is your new home, Ryder said, and Laura thought she detected a note of something like regret in his voice. They descended the final stretch of trail and rode into town just as the sun was setting behind the western mountains. People stopped to stare as they passed, and Laura was acutely aware of how they must look. Her dress stained and torn, her hair a tangled mess, riding pressed intimately against a massive mountain man who looked like he had stepped out of a frontier legend. Ryder guided Thunder to a stop in front of a building with a sign that read, Quartz Hill Hotel and Boarding House. He dismounted first, then carefully lifted Laura down, his hands gentle on her waist. For a moment they stood very close, his hands still on her own hands resting on his forearms, and Laura felt something pass between them, some wordless understanding that made her heart race. Thank you, she said softly, looking up into his dark eyes. For saving my life, for bringing me here safely, for everything. Ryder's expression was unreadable. You are welcome, Laura Emerson. I hope you find what you are looking for in this town. He started to turn away, but Laura caught his arm. Will I see you again? Ryder looked down at her hand on his arm, then back up at her face. I doubt it, he said quietly. I do not come down from the mountains often, And when I do not stay long. You will be busy with your school, and I will be busy preparing for winter. Our paths are not likely to cross again." Laura felt a sharp pang of loss that seemed entirely out of proportion to the brief time they had spent together. "But what if I need to thank you properly? What if I want to repay the debt I owe you?" "You owe me nothing," Ryder said firmly. He gently removed her hand from his arm and took a step back. "Live a good life, Laura. Teach those children well. That will be thanks enough." Before Laura could respond, the door to the boarding house flew open and a plump woman in her 50s bustled out, her face creased with concern. "Miss Emerson? Oh, my stars, we have been so worried. You were supposed to arrive yesterday, and when you did not show up, we feared the worst. Are you all right? What happened to you?" Laura tore her eyes away from Ryder to look at the woman. "I am fine, Mrs. Hooper," the woman supplied. "I am Martha Hooper, and I run this boarding house. But you poor dear, you look like you have been through an ordeal. Come inside at once and let me draw you a bath and get some proper food into you." Mrs. Hooper bustled forward and took Laura's arm, already beginning to usher her toward the door. Laura looked back over her shoulder at Ryder, who had already mounted Thunder and was preparing to ride away. "Wait!" Laura called out. "Will you at least tell me where I can find you? Your cabin?" Ryder shook his head. "It is better if you do not know," he said. Then he touched his fingers to the brim of his hat in a gesture of farewell and urged Thunder into a trot. Within seconds he had disappeared around the corner, and Laura felt as if something vital had been torn away from her. "Who was that man?" Mrs. Hooper asked, her eyes wide with curiosity and just a hint of scandal. "How did you come to be riding with him?" "He saved my life," Laura said simply. Then she turned and allowed Mrs. Hooper to lead her inside, though her thoughts remained on the mountain man who had already vanished back into his wilderness. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Laura met with the town council, who were relieved beyond measure that she had arrived safely despite her misadventure. She was shown the schoolhouse, a neat building at the edge of town with rows of wooden desks and a blackboard, and shelves that would soon be filled with books and slates and all the tools of education. She met the children who would be her students, ranging in age from 6 to 14, their faces eager and curious. She settled into her room at Mrs. Hooper's boarding house, which was small but comfortable, with a real bed and a washstand and a window that looked out over the main street. And through it all, she could not stop thinking about Ryder McAllister. She thought about him as she lay in bed at night, listening to the sounds of the town settling in for the evening. She thought about him as she organized her classroom and prepared her lessons. She thought about him as she sat at supper with the other boarders and listened to the local gossip and news. Midways, Hooper, sensing Laura's distraction, finally brought up the subject herself over breakfast one morning, about a week after Laura's arrival. "You're thinking about that mountain man, are you not?" she said, pouring Laura a fresh cup of coffee. "The one who brought you to town?" Laura felt her cheeks flush. "I am grateful to him," she said carefully. "He saved my life when a tree fell on me. I merely wish I had been able to thank him properly." Mrs. Hooper nodded knowingly. "That would be Ryder McAllister," she said. "He's been living up in those mountains for years now, all alone like some kind of hermit. He comes down once or twice a year to trade pelts and stock up on supplies, but he never stays more than a few hours. Folks say he is running from something, but no one knows what." "He told me," Laura said quietly, "about why he left civilization." Mrs. Hooper's eyebrows shot up. "He did? Well, that is something. Ryder McAllister is not known for being chatty. You must have made quite an impression on him." "I doubt that," Laura said, though her heart lifted a little at the thought. "He was just being kind." "Kind nothing," Mrs. Hooper said with a snort. "Dear girl, you do not know men if you think a fellow like Ryder McAllister rides 2 days out of his way to escort a woman to town just out of kindness. He could have left you at his cabin and sent word to town to come fetch you. But he did not. He brought you himself, and from what I heard from the folks who saw you arrive, he was holding you pretty close." Laura's blush deepened. "That was only because of my injuries. I could not sit a horse properly on my own." "If you say so," Mrs. Hooper said, but her tone suggested she thought otherwise. "All I'm saying is, if you want to see him again, you might not have to wait for fate to intervene. Ryder has a friend in town, the only person he will actually talk to when he comes down from the mountain, fellow named Doc Henderson. If you were to perhaps mention to the doc that you would like to get a message to Ryder, well, the doc might know how to make that happen. Laura's heart began to race. Do you think he would help me? Only one way to find out, Mrs. Hooper said with a wink. That afternoon, after her classes were finished for the day, Laura made her way to the doctor's office, which occupied a small building just off the main street. She knocked hesitantly on the door and was greeted by a man in his 60s with a shock of white hair and keen blue eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. Miss Emerson, he said warmly, I was wondering when you would pay me a visit. Please come in. Laura entered the office, which smelled of carbolic acid and dried herbs. You were expecting me? Martha Hooper has a bigger mouth than the Sacramento River, Doc Henderson said with a chuckle. She sent a boy over an hour ago to let me know you might be stopping by. I assume this is about Ryder McAllister? Laura nodded, feeling suddenly shy. I need to speak with him. I need to thank him properly for what he did. Mrs. Hooper suggested you might know how to get a message to him. Doc Henderson studied her carefully for a long moment, and Laura had the uncomfortable sensation of being weighed and measured. Finally, he nodded. I can get a message to him, the doctor said. Ryder has a drop box, a hollow tree about halfway up the mountain where I leave him medical supplies and news from the outside world. If he sees something in the box, he checks it within a day or two. But I have to warn you, Miss Emerson, Ryder is not a man who welcomes company. If you are hoping to start some kind of relationship with him, you are likely to be disappointed. I understand that, Laura said, though her heart sank a little at his words. But I need to try. He saved my life, Doctor, and I think maybe, just maybe, I might be able to help him in return. Help him how? Doc Henderson asked. By reminding him that not all people are cruel and faithless, Laura said. By showing him that there is still good in the world, still things worth coming down from his mountain for. The doctor smiled, a slow, knowing smile that made Laura suspect he understood far more than she had said. All right, he said. I will deliver your message. But what do you want me to tell him? Laura thought for a moment, then said, Tell him I would like to see him again. Tell him I want to repay his kindness with a home-cooked meal, nothing more. And tell him that if he is not interested, I will understand and will not bother him again. Fair enough, Doc Henderson said. He pulled out a piece of paper and a pencil and wrote down Laura's message, then folded it carefully and tucked it into his pocket. I will ride up there tomorrow and leave it in the drop box. After that, it is up to Ryder. Laura thanked him profusely and left the office feeling a strange mixture of hope and dread. She had taken the first step, made her intentions clear. Now all she could do was wait and see if Ryder would respond. 3 days passed with no word. Laura threw herself into her teaching, determined not to spend every moment watching the road for a sign of a man on a massive gray horse. But despite her best efforts, she found her attention wandering, her gaze drifting to the window whenever she heard hoofbeats in the street outside. On the 4th day, just as Laura was dismissing her students for the afternoon, there was a knock on the schoolhouse door. Laura's heart leapt into her throat as she opened it, but it was not Ryder standing there. It was a young boy of about 10, one of her students, holding a folded piece of paper. Miss Emerson, the boy said breathlessly, the doc asked me to give this to you. He said it was real important. Laura took the paper with trembling hands and unfolded it. The handwriting was bold and angular, clearly written by a man not accustomed to using a pen. Miss Emerson, I received your message. If you are still interested in that dinner, I will come to town on Saturday evening. Doc Henderson says I can use his house, as it would not be proper for you to have a man in your room at the boarding house. If this is acceptable to you, send word with the boy. Ryder McAllister. Laura read the note 3 times, her heart pounding so hard she was surprised the boy could not hear it. Saturday was just 2 days away. Tell the doctor it is acceptable, Laura said, her voice surprisingly steady. Tell him I will be there at 6 o'clock on Saturday evening. The boy nodded and ran off, and Laura sank into one of the student desks, the note still clutched in her hand. He had agreed. He was coming. She was going to see him again. The next 2 days were a torment of anticipation and preparation. Laura consulted with Mrs. Hooper about what to cook, finally settling on a menu of roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and an apple pie for dessert. She borrowed Mrs. Hooper's kitchen on Saturday afternoon and spent hours preparing the meal, her hands shaking with nerves the entire time. By 5:30, everything was ready and packed into baskets. Laura changed into her best dress, a soft green calico that brought out the color of her eyes, and arranged her honey-colored hair in an elegant knot at the nape of her neck. She surveyed herself in the mirror and hoped she looked pretty, then immediately felt foolish for caring so much. Doc Henderson had graciously agreed to vacate his house for the evening, and he met Laura at the door with a knowing smile when she arrived with her baskets of food. "He is already here," the doctor said quietly. "Arrived about 20 minutes ago looking like a man heading for his own execution. Go easy on him, Miss Emerson. He's more nervous than he is letting on." Laura nodded, her own nerves ratcheting up another notch. She took a deep breath, smoothed her dress, and entered the doctor's parlor. Ryder was standing by the window, his back to the door, and for a moment Laura simply looked at him. He had cleaned up for the occasion, his hair washed and pulled back with a leather cord, his buckskin shirt replaced with a plain cotton one that stretched across his broad shoulders. He turned as he heard her enter, and the expression on his face when he saw her made Laura's breath catch. "Hello, Ryder," she said softly. "Laura," he replied, his voice rough. "You look beautiful." "Thank you," Laura said, feeling her cheeks warm. "You look very handsome yourself." They stood there for a moment in awkward silence, and then Laura laughed, breaking the tension. "I feel like I am 16 years old at my first social," she admitted. "This is ridiculous. You've already seen me at my absolute worst, covered in dirt and tears with my dress torn. Surely we can manage to have a civilized dinner together." Ryder's expression relaxed into something that might have been a smile. "I suppose we can try," he said. The meal was a success, much to Laura's relief. The food was good and the conversation flowed more easily than she had dared hope. They talked about books and the changing seasons and the small happenings of life in Quartz Hill. Ryder seemed genuinely interested in Laura's work as a teacher, asking thoughtful questions about her methods and her students. It was only after they had finished eating and were sitting over coffee that the conversation turned more personal. "Why did you ask me to come here tonight?" Ryder asked, his dark eyes searching her face. "The truth, Laura. Not the polite excuse about thanking me." Laura set down her coffee cup carefully, gathering her courage. "Because I have not been able to stop thinking about you," she admitted. "From the moment you lifted that tree off me, from the moment you held me in your arms and carried me to safety, I have felt this connection to you. I know it sounds foolish, and I know we barely know each other, but I had to see you again. I had to know if you felt it too." Ryder was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he said, "I felt it. From the moment I saw you trapped under that tree, something changed inside me. For 8 years, I have been perfectly content with my solitude, with my self-imposed exile from humanity. And then, in the space of a single day, you made me question everything. You made me remember what it feels like to care about someone other than myself." Laura's heart soared. "Then why do you look so troubled?" "Because caring about people is dangerous," Ryder said, his voice low and intense. "Because when you let someone in, they have the power to hurt you. And I cannot go through that again, Laura. I cannot survive another betrayal." Laura reached across the table and took his hand, her small fingers wrapping around his much larger ones. "I am not Catherine," she said firmly, "and you are not the same man you were 8 years ago. We are both different people, marked by our pasts but not defined by them. If you push away every possibility of connection because you are afraid of being hurt, you are just as much a prisoner now as you were when you lived in San Francisco." Ryder looked down at their joined hands, and Laura could see the conflict playing out across his face. Fear warring with hope, the desire for safety battling against the longing for something more. "I do not know how to do this," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I do not know how to open myself up again, how to trust." "Then we will learn together," Laura said gently. "One day at a time, one step at a time. No pressure, no expectations, just two people getting to know each other and seeing where it leads." Ryder looked up at her then, and the vulnerability in his eyes made Laura's heart ache. "What if I disappoint you? What if I am not capable of being what you need?" "What if you are?" Laura countered. "What if we are exactly what we each need and we are too afraid to find out?" Ryder stood abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the darkening street. Laura waited, giving him the space he needed to think. After what felt like an eternity, he turned back to face her. "I want to try," he said, the words coming out as if they were being torn from somewhere deep inside him. "God help me, I want to try. But I am not going to be easy to be with, Laura. I am rough and set in my ways. I have spent 8 years talking more to my horse than to people. I do not know how to make small talk or attend social functions or any of the things you probably expect from a suitor." Laura stood and crossed to him, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. "I do not want a polished gentleman who knows all the right things to say," she told him. "I want you, Ryder McAllister, rough edges and all." For a moment they simply looked at each other, and then Ryder bent his head and kissed her. It was gentle at first, almost tentative, as if he were afraid she might shatter under his touch. But when Laura made a soft sound of encouragement and pressed closer to him, the kiss deepened, becoming something more urgent and real. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. Ryder rested his forehead against Laura's, his arms wrapped around her waist as if he were afraid to let her go. "This is crazy," he murmured. "We have known each other less than 2 weeks." "I know," Laura agreed, "but sometimes crazy is the only thing that makes sense." They spent the rest of the evening talking, really talking, sharing the stories of their lives with an honesty that felt both frightening and liberating. Ryder told Laura about his childhood on the Missouri farm, about his parents and his journey west and the years he had spent as a lawman. He talked about the betrayal and the rage, and the desperate need to escape from everything and everyone. Laura, in turn, told him about her own difficult childhood, about her father's violence and her mother's early death, and her determination to make something of herself despite the odds stacked against her. She talked about her love of teaching and her dreams for the future. As the hours passed, they discovered they had more in common than either of them had expected. Both had been wounded by life. Both had learned to be self-sufficient and strong. But beneath the armor they had each constructed, they found kindred spirits, 2 souls who had been searching for something without even knowing what it was. When Doc Henderson finally returned around 10 o'clock, discreetly clearing his throat to announce his presence, Ryder and Laura were sitting close together on the sofa, her hand in his, talking quietly. "I hate to interrupt," the doctor said with barely concealed amusement, "but it is getting late, and I suspect Mrs. Hooper will have my hide if Miss Emerson does not return soon." Laura stood reluctantly, and Ryder rose with her. At the door, he caught her hand and pulled her back for one more kiss, this one soft and sweet and full of promise. "When can I see you again?" he asked. "Whenever you want," Laura said. "I am not going anywhere." "Next Saturday?" Ryder suggested. "I could come to town again, maybe take you for a ride if you were feeling up to it." "I would like that very much," Laura said. True to his word, Ryder appeared in town the following Saturday astride Thunder, and Laura met him at the edge of town wearing a split riding skirt that Mrs. Hooper had grudgingly helped her acquire. They rode out into the countryside, staying on relatively flat terrain in deference to Laura's still healing injuries, and spent the afternoon talking and laughing and simply enjoying each other's company. It became a pattern over the following weeks. Ryder would come to town every Saturday, and they would spend the day together. Sometimes they rode out into the hills. Sometimes they walked along the creek. Sometimes they simply sat in Doc Henderson's parlor and talked for hours. The people of Quartz Hill watched this courtship with great interest, and opinions were divided. Some thought it was romantic, a wild mountain man tamed by the love of a good woman. Others thought Laura was making a terrible mistake, throwing away her respectability for a man who would never truly fit into civilized society. Laura did not care what anyone thought. For the first time in her life, she was completely and wholly happy. Ryder made her laugh, made her think, made her feel safe and cherished in a way she had never experienced before. And she could see the changes in him too, the way he was slowly opening up, allowing himself to hope and to feel and to trust. By the time October arrived, painting the hills in shades of gold and crimson, they were deeply in love. Neither of them had said the words yet, but it hung between them like something tangible and precious, waiting for the right moment. That moment came on a crisp Saturday afternoon as they sat on a blanket beneath an oak tree, watching the sun sink toward the western mountains. Ryder had been quieter than usual all day, and Laura had sensed he was working up to something. "Laura," he said finally, turning to face her, "I need to tell you something." All right, Laura said, her heart beginning to race. I love you, Ryder said, the words coming out in a rush as if he were afraid he would lose his nerve if he did not say them quickly. I'm in love with you, and I do not know when it happened or how, but it is true. You have become the most important thing in my life, and I cannot imagine going back to the way things were before I met you. Laura felt tears spring to her eyes. I love you too, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I have loved you almost from the beginning, I think. When you lifted that tree, you did not just save my body, you saved my heart too. Ryder pulled her into his arms and kissed her with a passion that left them both breathless. When they finally broke apart, he reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in soft leather. I made this for you, he said, unwrapping the leather to reveal a ring. It was beautifully crafted from silver, with a small piece of quartz set in the center, the stone catching the fading sunlight and throwing off tiny rainbows. Ryder, Laura breathed, staring at the ring in wonder. It is beautiful. It is not much, Ryder said, suddenly sounding uncertain. Not like what you could get in a real jewelry store. But I made it myself, and the stone is from the mountain, from near my cabin. I thought maybe you would like to have a piece of that place, since it is where we met. It is perfect, Laura said firmly. Absolutely perfect. Ryder took her left hand and held it gently. Laura Emerson, will you marry me? Will you take on a rough mountain man who does not have much to offer except his whole heart and a fierce determination to make you happy for the rest of your life? Yes, Laura said without hesitation. Yes, 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 1,000 times yes. Ryder slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made just for her. Which, of course, it had. They were married 6 weeks later, on the first Saturday in December, in the white-steepled church in Quartz Hill. Doc Henderson stood up as Ryder's best man, and Mrs. Hooper served as Laura's matron of honor, sniffling loudly throughout the ceremony. Nearly the entire town turned out for the wedding, curiosity and genuine goodwill bringing them to witness the union of the schoolteacher and the mountain man. Laura wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Hooper and several other ladies had helped her sew, with wildflowers from the hills woven into her hair. Ryder wore new clothes purchased especially for the occasion, though he drew the line at a tie, claiming it made him feel like he was being strangled. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, and Ryder kissed his bride, the church erupted in applause and cheers. They walked out into the winter sunshine hand in hand, and Laura thought she had never seen Ryder look so happy, his usually serious face split by a wide grin. The question of where they would live had been a source of some discussion in the weeks leading up to the wedding. Ryder's cabin was too small and too remote for Laura to continue her teaching, but the thought of living in town made him visibly uncomfortable. In the end, they worked out a compromise that satisfied them both. They would spend the school year living in Quartz Hill, in a small house that the town council helped them purchase on the edge of town. But during the summer months and the Christmas break, they would go up to Ryder's cabin in the mountains, where Laura could experience the wilderness life that was so much a part of her husband. It was not a conventional arrangement, but nothing about their relationship had been conventional from the start. And as they settled into married life, they found that the balance between civilization and wilderness suited them both perfectly. Laura continued to teach during the day, shaping young minds and instilling in her students a love of learning. Ryder took on work around town, using his considerable strength and skills to help with building projects and heavy labor. He was still not comfortable with crowds or social events, but he made an effort for Laura's sake, attending church suppers and town meetings with her. And when the summer came, they closed up their house and rode up into the mountains together, thunder carrying them both just as he had on that first journey to town. Laura fell in love with the cabin and with the wild beauty of the high country, and Ryder taught her everything he knew about living in harmony with the land. They were happy in a way that neither of them had ever thought possible. The wounds of their pasts slowly healed, replaced by the joy and security of genuine love and partnership. They talked for hours, sharing their thoughts and dreams and fears. They laughed together and worked together and explored the physical side of their love with a passion that surprised them both. A year after their wedding, on a warm evening in early November, Laura told Ryder she was pregnant. He stared at her in stunned silence for a long moment, and then he swept her up in his arms and spun her around, laughing with pure joy. They held each other close, and Ryder placed his large hand gently on Laura's still flat stomach, marveling at the miracle growing inside her. Their son was born the following summer, delivered by Doc Henderson in the cabin high in the mountains where his parents had first truly begun to know each other. They named him Thomas Emerson McAllister, and Laura saw the tears in Ryder's eyes when he held his son for the first time. By giving the baby the name of the man who had betrayed him, Ryder was finally letting go of the past, choosing forgiveness and hope over bitterness and isolation. Thomas grew strong and healthy, with his father's dark eyes and his mother's honey-colored hair. 2 years later, a daughter joined the family, whom they named Catherine Grace, completing Ryder's journey of forgiveness. And 2 years after that, another son arrived, whom they named Daniel after Laura's father, because Laura insisted that every person, no matter how flawed, deserved to be remembered by someone who loved them. The years passed in a blur of happiness and hard work. Laura's school flourished, and many of her students went on to successful lives, never forgetting the teacher who had believed in them. Ryder became a respected member of the Quartz Hill community, known for his quiet strength and his willingness to help anyone in need. As their children grew, Ryder and Laura made sure to pass on the lessons they had learned. They taught Thomas, Catherine, and Daniel about the importance of education and hard work, about treating all people with respect regardless of their station in life, and about the incredible power of forgiveness and second chances. They also made sure their children knew the story of how their parents met, how a fallen tree and a desperate scream had brought together two wounded souls and given them both a second chance at happiness. It became a family legend, told and retold around the dinner table in the fireplace, the story of how their father had lifted an impossible weight to save their mother, and how their mother had in turn lifted the weight of loneliness and pain that had been crushing their father's heart. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Ryder and Laura rode back up to the cabin in the mountains, leaving their now-grown children to manage things in town for a few days. They stood together on the trail where that fateful tree had fallen so many years ago, the stump now rotted and covered with moss, and they held each other close. "Do you ever regret it?" Laura asked, looking up at her husband. His hair was touched with gray now, and there were lines around his eyes, but he was still the strong, protective man who had saved her life all those years ago. "Do you ever wish you had stayed in your cabin, alone and undisturbed?" Ryder looked down at her and smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "Not for a single second," he said firmly. "You gave me back my life, Laura. You taught me how to trust again, how to love again. You and our children are the best things that ever happened to me." "You saved me too," Laura said softly. "Not just from that tree, but from a lonely life of going through the motions without ever really living. You showed me what it means to be truly loved and cherished." They kissed then, a gentle, tender kiss that held the weight of 25 years of love and partnership and shared joy. When they finally pulled apart, they walked hand in hand back to the cabin, where they would spend the next few days alone together, remembering and celebrating all that they had built together. The years continued to pass, bringing grandchildren and great-grandchildren, new joys and new challenges. Ryder and Laura grew old together, their love deepening with each passing season. They remained in Quartz Hill, beloved fixtures of the community, their story inspiring young couples who were just beginning their own journeys. On a warm spring morning in 1928, 50 years after that fateful day on the mountain trail, Ryder McAllister passed away peacefully in his sleep, his hand clasped in Laura's. He was 78 years old, and he had lived a long, full life filled with love and purpose. Laura grieved deeply, but she did not despair. She knew that death was a natural part of life, and she took comfort in the fact that they had been given so many years together, years they might never have had if not for a fallen tree and the incredible strength of the man who had lifted it. She continued to live in their house in Quartz Hill, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all of whom carried forward the legacy of love and resilience that Ryder and Laura had built together. She told the story of their meeting over and over, making sure that future generations would know how their family had begun, how one act of desperate strength and courage had changed everything. Laura Emerson McAllister lived to be 93 years old, and when she finally joined her beloved husband in death on a crisp autumn day in 1943, the entire town of Quartz Hill mourned. They buried her next to Ryder in the cemetery on the hill above the town, under the spreading branches of an oak tree that had been planted the year they were married. On their shared headstone, their children had inscribed a simple epitaph that captured the essence of their love story. He lifted the tree that trapped her. She lifted the loneliness that trapped him. Together, they built a love that could move mountains. And so the story ended as all the best stories do, with love conquering fear, with hope triumphing over despair, and with two people who had been broken by life finding wholeness in each other. The mountain man and the school teacher had found their happy ending, not in the absence of challenges or pain, but in the choice to face life together, supporting each other through whatever came their way. Their descendants continued to live in and around Quartz Hill, California, carrying forward the values and lessons that Ryder and Laura had instilled in them. And on quiet evenings when the wind whispered through the pines and the sun set behind the western mountains, it was said that you could still feel their presence in the land they had loved so much, two souls forever intertwined, their love as enduring as the mountains themselves. The schoolhouse where Laura had taught for so many years was eventually named in her honor, and a statue was erected in the town square showing a powerful man lifting an enormous log, a small plaque at the base telling the story of Ryder McAllister and the day he had moved heaven and earth to save the woman who would become his wife. And so the legacy lived on, generation after generation, a testament to the power of love and the incredible things that can happen when two people are brave enough to take a chance on each other, to open their hearts despite the risk of pain, and to build something beautiful and lasting together. It was a story of strength, not just the physical strength required to lift an impossible weight, but the emotional strength required to trust again, to love again, to believe that happiness is possible even after the deepest heartbreak. In the end, that was the true miracle of Ryder and Laura's story. Not that he had lifted a tree with his bare hands, though that was remarkable enough, but that they had lifted each other out of the darkness of their pasts and into a future filled with light and love and endless possibilities. And that, more than anything else, was a legacy worth celebrating, worth remembering, and worth passing down through the generations as a reminder that love, true love, can indeed move mountains.